Hadar, it does feel like the messages are running potentially into some conflict here. As Blinken says, yes, Israel is behind this. Netanyahu has reaffirmed this, but Netanyahu and his government also reaffirmed that they want to see Hamas entirely destroyed, and a ceasefire agreement would potentially make that difficult to accomplish. And for Hamas saying that it does support the UN ceasefire resolution, we haven't seen all of the parties come out and say the ceasefire begins. So what is your understanding of what exactly is happening here?
Well, Kayleigh, I think what we're seeing is both the Netanyahu government and the Hamas leadership want to be seen by the U.S., by the UN, globally, as saying yes to this. They want to be seen as the party that is moving toward peace. At the same time, while Netanyahu just reaffirmed it and Hamas has now welcomed the UN resolution, neither one has said, okay, let's sit down. Let's start talking. Let's implement the ceasefire. They've both agreed in principle and said, all right, now let's start talking about the details, while at the same time both telling their domestic audiences nothing has changed. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu and others in his government are still saying they're going to completely destroy Hamas. The war is not over until, again, Hamas is completely eliminated, and other very non-specific goals like that are frankly pretty impossible to measure. And Hamas, quite similarly, has accepted the principle, but is still launching attacks, obviously has not released hostages, and is still telling its constituency that its plans haven't changed either.
So bring us to a finer point here, Hadar. We all saw the president roll out a fairly detailed three-phased plan that seemed to be something everybody had their eyes on here. But your point is a good one. Once all the parties sit down, they have to hammer out the fine print. What will be the sticking points when that happens?
Well, there's really one big one, right? The president's plan that he proposed, which again was presented as an Israeli proposal, not the president's proposal himself, said a 6-week ceasefire during which certain hostages would be released and negotiations would start for a long-term ceasefire, for a cessation of hostilities, actually, not just a ceasefire. And the president said, if after those 6 weeks, everything has not been finalized yet, but negotiations are ongoing, then that the ceasefire would hold. And the real difference, the break point here, is this insistence by Netanyahu that they will not end the war until Hamas is completely eliminated. And Hamas is, of course, insistence that they are not going to disappear. So that's the difference. The 6 weeks can be worked out, even the hostage release and the prisoner exchange, because part of this is, of course, Palestinian prisoners who are held in Israeli prisons being released. All of that could be worked out if the two sides would be willing to sit down and do so. But the whole plan here is to get to an actual end game. It's not just to have this short term and this, prisoner hostage exchange. And that's where the seemingly unbridgeable difference is.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed it was unbridgeable even inside the Israeli government, because it was a disagreement over what exactly the end game should be that drove Benny Gantz out of the government, out of the war cabinet. He was unhappy with the prime minister not meeting his demands. What influence do you think that departure ultimately has on how this moves forward, Hadar?
Well, Gantz and his folks leaving still leaves Netanyahu with a 64-seat majority in the 120-seat Knesset. So it doesn't change anything immediately in terms of going to new elections. But it's one more sort of push, one more data point, because ultimately what we're going to need is to get to this agreement is a call for new elections and a new government. There is no way that this government, with not only Netanyahu, but the parties led by Ben Gvir and Smotrich, those two in particular, will absolutely never agree to any kind of agreement. They've been quite clear on that. Now, the opposition parties led by Yair Lapid, Yair Golan, and others have said that should Netanyahu move forward with this agreement, they would support his government from the outside, not as members, to implement the agreement. But that would mean that sort of starts the clock ticking on the process of moving toward new elections. And the thing that is maybe the most interesting thing that came up this week is there's a lot of talk now that Netanyahu himself may be getting to the point where he realized he's played out this line. This government he's dragged it out in all these different ways. He's done all these different things, and he may be ready to start organizing for new elections sooner rather than later.
Fascinating. How about the war cabinet, so-called, Hadar? Is Benny Gantz replaced by a hardliner, or does the war cabinet begin to fracture?
Well, the only people left in the government are very hardliners. And, Ben Gvir, who has not had a seat in that war cabinet, has been demanding one. It's one of the things he wants to see happen. Frankly, I don't think it makes a very big difference whether he has that seat or not, because there are now no contrasting voices within the government. So the war cabinet becomes largely irrelevant, frankly, because you did have Gantz and his deputy Eisenkot sitting there with presumably at least some differing views, some moderating views. Now that they're out, the only voices in the government are very hardline. You also really have only one leader in the government with significant military experience, which is Yoav Gallant, the Secretary of Defense. Because again, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, the religious party leaders, none of those people even served their regular, 3 years of military service, much less were they generals and military leaders. So they've really thinned the bench there within the coalition.
Hadar, do you think repeated visits like what we're seeing from the Secretary of State, are actually helpful in all of this? He has been to the Middle East now 8 times since October 7th, and it seems pretty consistently he leaves empty-handed, even though he says things like Netanyahu, when he spoke with him, still reaffirmed his commitments to a ceasefire agreement. Is the U.S. government helping?
Well, they're certainly trying to help, and I think that there are benefits to these visits. Remember, they're not solely for the purpose of meeting with Netanyahu or Israeli leaders. I met with Palestinian leaders, Jordanians, many others as well, and it's part of patching together, the necessary coalition to have the political backing to move this forward. Look, I think the U.S. government can and should do more, and can and should take a stronger position vis-a-vis the Israeli government. But what's sure is that this is not moving forward without that significant push from the Americans. And so having Secretary Blinken there, President Biden has been himself, so many of our other leaders, Burns, Jake Sherman, and others have been there, I think is important in trying to move these conversations forward. The question is, what's going to be the ultimate push, the ultimate declaration that nudges Netanyahu across the line? Because we can talk and talk and talk, and what we've seen now is many months of talking about ceasefires, talking about process, talking about different opportunities and different deals, but at the end, there's a binary decision, right? Yes or no. Is there a ceasefire? And whatever it is, we haven't gotten to that point yet. And I think the next big question or the next big moment out there is, of course, we have Netanyahu scheduled to come here to Washington on July 24th now. And we'll see what the situation is, on that day.